That's good. It's going to be quite a busy few days and weeks, let's say, till the replant.
Yes, we'll need lots of energy. So I'm glad it works out that way.
Sure thing. Right, welcome everyone to class. Before we start off, just want to announce or let everyone know that Halborn, who were one of our auditors, are going to be they're going to join us in this week's DAO meeting. That's on Thursday, and they'll present their product Seraph. Seraph is supposed to be like a third party, let's say, auditor that checks any commitments or any updates that are gonna happen on chain. In the announcement channel, you'll find their pitch deck, basically, summarizing what Seraph is and what the advantages of it are. Feel free to read it and join DAO meeting, and you can ask them questions directly. And Publius, add anything else if I missed anything. Okay. Let's start class. Anyone with any questions, feel free to drop them in the town hall chat. Otherwise, we can start. I can start with a question of mine. So Publius, right now the field issues zero coupon bonds. And we know that previous, let's say, iterations of bond systems or protocols issued some sort of different types of bonds. Let's say, what do you think about the field issuing other types of bonds other than zero coupon bonds in parallel to zero coupon bonds as well? So one idea could be that it can issue, let's say, a bond that expires within 3 months or 6 months. At an interest rate that is higher than what the field typically issues for zero coupon bonds, but comes with the risk of expiring if demand for beans don't catch up during that period of time.
So first, there have been other stablecoin protocols that have been based off of the seigniorage shares models that have zero coupon bonds. The main difference between Beanstalk and those models on the debt side is that those bonds are not fungible, not pari passu, and instead are first in, first out. So whereas other implementations of zero coupon bonds where there's either a bidding mechanism or somehow you're locking in your return at the time of purchase, the main issue is that what you're purchasing is not or is fungible. So there's no advantage to buying early. Now, with regards to your question about should Beanstalk offer non-zero coupon bonds or offer some sort of yield, probably not would be my thought, although I haven't really thought about this at all. But the concept is that the yield for holding beans typically comes from the silo, whereas the yield for the field comes from burning the beans. And if the assets in the field were owed some sort of continued interest, that would, to some extent, diminish the effect of lending beans to Beanstalk as it's currently constructed, because currently the beans are permanently removed from the supply. And so if now there's some promise to pay beans continuously, that only temporarily removes beans from the supply. And that does significantly change Beanstalk's ability to maintain peg in theory. So I wouldn't think that the commitment to pay beans, particularly newly minted beans, at specific points in time, that would be something to avoid. You'd certainly want to avoid at the protocol level.
What about another pod line that basically then you're cutting off the line, but at the risk of it expiring at a certain time period? So it's not like current bonds where they don't expire. So it would be something like buy this bond. It expires.
So separate from
months.
The coupon, now you're talking about the fact that the bonds never expire. You're now saying some sort of bond that does expire, and see if Beanstalk can get away with lending or borrowing funds, issuing debt that expires. Now, I mean, in theory, there's nothing wrong with it if the market will demand it. But when it comes to the credit worthiness of Beanstalk, there is something to be said for the protocol never defaulting on pods, and pods expiring is in practice some sort of default. So would think that probably wouldn't help the credit of Beanstalk. But then again, it doesn't really have to do with the FIFO zero coupon bonds that never expire. But separately, yeah, I mean, there's something to be said for, and I would just take this opportunity to do so, that the fact that there's this recapitalization and now some pods and their place in line are being pushed back because of the obligation from Beanstalk to pay fertilizer. I think going forward, that's something that we collectively should still try to avoid, should avoid at most costs, in the sense that you don't really want to be constantly degrading the value of the pods by pushing them back and what bean supply they'll get paid back. So I think there was obviously exigent circumstances that the Dow collectively decided to, instead of a haircut of pods, pay them back over a longer period of time, or over a longer period of supply increase might be an accurate way of saying it. But in general, I think collectively we should probably stay away from continuing to do that, particularly in normal circumstances. So probably wouldn't think that makes sense given the effect on the credit of Beanstalk and its relationship to creditors as well as that.
Okay. We have a question from Harry Smith. He asks, did we get the final 12 bits audit report?
Not yet. As soon as we have it, we will pass it along and make sure that it's published. The 10 business days, I think, is on Thursday. So the expectation is that we will have it by then. And, assuming we get it by Thursday, and that there's no problems in the report, which we don't expect there to be at this point, then it will be all systems go.
All right. My next question may be a bit of a long one. Let's see if I can, first of all, articulate it well and then summarize it as well. Been thinking a bit about how fractional banking systems work. And to summarize how that works, it basically increases the money supply in an economy through credit. And that's basically, known as the money multiplier. So let's say the central bank introduces, $10 to a bank, depending on the fraction that it's required, or depending on the amount that is required to keep in its reserves. The extra amount gets added into the economy, and that multiplies the amount of money that's in the economy. So here are my thoughts, or here's my question: what if we have banks built on top of Beanstalk? So let's call this the Farmers Bank. And the way that the Farmers Bank would work is if that bank has 100 beans in it, that bank would issue mint, let's say, 100 other tokens 1-to-1 for those beans. So it has 100 beans. It would then mint, let's say, 100 red beans, and red beans are whitelisted in the silo. So the silo accepts those banks and accepts their tokens in it. So 100 beans, you have 100 red beans, and the 100 red beans are in the silo accruing seniorage or the interest rate that's generated by the silo. The Farmers Bank then is able to lend those 100 beans that it has, since it's free now to do whatever it wants to do with it at whatever interest rate that it chooses. How would that work? So let's say now there is a demand for beans, and the price of bean is above 1. What would happen then is that the bank would lend beans at a low interest rate. So if you want beans, because there is a lot of demand for beans, you would go there, and then you suddenly would have extra 100 beans, since the red beans are in the silo, but the 100 beans are available for anyone to borrow, and that would then naturally increases the supply of beans, or in effect it will multiply depending on how much you're allowing beans to be out. Let's say then the demand for beans drops. What would the bank do then is it would increase the interest rate for those beans that are already lent, and that would naturally force people to take out those beans and return their loans, effectively reducing the supply of beans. So what we're saying is, with the same amount of beans that are already existing with that bank, depending on the interest rate, which you're increasing or decreasing it, is whether there is a high demand or low demand, you're increasing the supply or reducing the supply of beans in the market. Does this make sense, or did I lose you?
So there's a lot to be said here. I would say the first thing is that technically the increase in the money supply via credit from banks is not the same thing as money, right? And in your example, red beans are not the same as beans. Now, I guess if one red bean is always redeemable at all times for one bean, you could make the argument that it is a bean, but it's still not exactly a bean. And so the concept is now the increase in supply of red beans goes to the profit associated with the increase in supply of red beans goes to the bank, as opposed to, and then the bank can pass on some of that to the depositors. But the concept is the bank is taking the profit here. Now, normally, when there's an increase in demand for beans, there is the result is an increase in the bean price, which Beanstalk has to increase the supply in order to return the equilibrium price to $1. And the whitelisting of red beans in the silo would effectively facilitate the transfer of the seigniorage from stockholders to this bank or whoever owns the underlying collateral of the red bean. And that wouldn't really make sense to do. So I think as a starting point, it's hard to think about this as as a viable business model, particularly. I mean, there's a lot I could say on this front, but I think just to answer your question explicitly, it probably wouldn't make sense for the DAO to whitelist the red beans and facilitate this business model, because it's a great gig if you can get it. If you're this bank and you're now collecting the difference between the silo yield and this yield that you're offering depositors, but why would you as a depositor accept that? And why would stockholders accept that either?
Great questions. So red beans, there are multiple ways, I guess, to design this, but let's take the most conservative one and say that a red bean is always backed by one bean. Now, what happens, when the bank is lending those beans to others? What is it backed by? So you back that by collateral. It just happens to be what are you backing it, or at what rate are you lending it at? So for every red bean that's in the silo, it is either backed by an actual bean that is still with the bank, or by a collateral instead of the bean that was lent out. So why would stockholders want this? Because at the end of the day, it is an actual bean or worth of a bean that's in the silo. But what you did there is the total, instead of that money being, or instead of those beans being in the silo, you are now allowing it to go out to the market at a low interest rate when the demand for beans are high. So you're suddenly able to increase or multiply the bean supply. When you want to increase bean supply, that's when there is demand for beans are high. And then when demands for beans drop, you increase those interest rates, and then you reduce the supply of beans because people will want to return it. Otherwise, you're going to be paying that interest.
It's very interesting. It's a very interesting point, and I would have to think. I'd have to think more deeply on it before commenting.
Okay. My last question goes back to something that we discussed a few weeks ago, and that's leverage. As derivative markets get built on top of Beanstalk, and people will be allowed to long and short beans. The question that I want to think of is, how do we protect Beanstalk from leverage? Throughout history, as during recessions, we see that the big culprit is typically how leveraged or how levered the economy is. And the higher the leverage, the more dangerous the economy or the recession, the severity of it gets. And that's because, as prices drop, people get liquidated, prices drop further, then further people get liquidated, and you enter into this, cycle or loop that you're in it. The way modern economies or economies today control this is, by regulation. You regulate the markets and you set a limit to how much, markets can be leveraged. This is something that is not really possible in DeFi, given that you don't have a centralized authority. There is no regulation or way for you to control that. My question is, and I'm not sure if there is an answer here. Once we have derivative markets built on top of Beanstalk, how can we protect Beanstalk from over leverage or from, a market that's too leveraged?
Great question. So the punchline is with a low A parameter. The more sophisticated answer is that if you think about what the trade was associated with UST, it was really to short UST, right? You're borrowing, you're holding, you're buying UST, and you're lending it out or borrowing it because it was subsidized. But the concept is, in some capacity, you're holding the UST and then selling the UST to take on leverage. And it was really to take on leverage of the Luna price. That was what most people were doing for the trade. But the concept is that was a really safe trade when it comes to, and I'm not talking about safe in general, we saw the system played out, but when it comes to shorting UST, and that was also something that facilitated the unwinding, separate from people who were going short UST and long Luna. So the system was highly leveraged, as you were saying. When people got short the system during the unwind, this also played out. The concept is it's very attractive to short a stable coin that is convertible at its peg. And if you have convertibility, what that really means is that the price has a hard peg. It's never going to go above whatever it's convertible at. So no one's going to pay $1.01 if you can convert and mint them at the price. So why would you buy at $1.01 if you can mint the stable coin for $1? And the result is that people could comfortably borrow and either go long Luna or short UST in whatever capacity, but long other assets if they wanted to, but certainly short UST. It was very attractive to do that because the price, by definition, couldn't go up. Whereas in the case of Beanstalk, the bean price oscillates above and below $1. And as we all know, when there is not enough supply and excess demand, the bean price goes higher. And in short, the upside and downside volatility can minimize the amount of derivatives exposure that is unhealthy on the positive and negative side when it comes to bean price movement. So the short answer is Beanstalk needs to welcome volatility, and constant oscillations above and below the peg need to be the norm and expected, as opposed to a hard peg maintained by convertibility.
Okay. Am I understanding this correctly when we say that a way, I guess, to protect against, that's maybe probably not accurate. I was going to say that you would expect that short positions would counter, an effect of how much long positions you have to kind of have a balance, but you can't really regulate how much leverage is in the system at the end. So you just want to accept it, or would have to accept it.
You cannot regulate it in any capacity other than the market finding an equilibrium based on the volatility that exists in the underlying.
Some ways that I can think of, and I don't think these are good ideas, but that's
and over time the Beanstalk interest rates in the silo. Sorry to interrupt, but that would be the other thing that people are optimizing around.
Yeah, this was going to be my point, which is discouraging leverage by reducing demand interest for that's giving out or the seniorage that's paid out. But I don't see how that really works, or how can we do this because reducing seniorage, you're basically inhibiting demand, so you can't meet any demand anymore. But yeah,
at the end of the day, when you have liquidity on Beanstalk assets, right? Let's say there's a fungible silo bean. There's nothing to prevent that from being levered up or levered short in a money market or in a CDP. So at the end of the day, this is the whole concept of Beanstalk, is that if beans are to become a base primitive that people build on top of because of their relative stability and positive carry, you have to be able to take out leverage against it. So how does the system regulate? It has to regulate itself through market forces, which is kind of the elegance of a free market that we're all subscribing to here. So if the incentives are sufficiently strong, that should create the stability over slightly longer periods of time than convertibility offers.
Yeah, I agree. All right, these are the questions that I had. I don't see other questions from others. So if others, had any questions or had any follow-up questions to what we've discussed, please feel free to drop them in the town hall chat. Harry Smith asks, any updates on Root? I can answer that by saying we'll probably have something next week, but Mr. Manifold, feel free to come in if you want to share more details. Otherwise, expect to hear something next week. I see someone typing, so we'll wait. We'll wait for that question. The other thing, building on the idea of the second question, which is if you have a bank built on top of Beanstalk, is you allow lending of course at variable rates. These rates do control the supply of potentially of what total supply of beans that will be out there, but in effect or in principle, it allows lending, so people can instead of buying beans, they can borrow beans. Maybe that will also facilitate other things or other markets as well. CJ Discord asks, what is the chance that there is a lack of demand for pods or debt, and will this make it difficult to get back to peg?
It's hard to evaluate what are the chances that there's a lack of demand for pods. On the one hand, prior to the attack, pods seem to be, or the temperature, I should say, seemed to have been heavily mispriced, way too high. But that's, one of the things about Beanstalk is that it changes the temperature very slowly, such that it's still like a 52x or something like that, 58x. I don't remember what it was prior to the attack, but the concept is that's still going to be a very high interest rate. Whether people find that attractive to get to the back of a pod line and the fertilizer, very hard to speculate on that, but the concept is, I think we'll find out very shortly. This goes back to the market will decide.
I can build up on this question, and that's about the temperature control, or how is it increased and decreased. What do we think about? And maybe we had these discussions months ago, so we might be recycling some of these thoughts again. What if we do something in the sense that when there is a change in the price of bean, the field would increase the temperature once by a certain amount, and then it goes back to the +3 -1. So let's say the price of bean is at 1, and the temperature is at, let's say, 5,000. If the price of bean goes from 1 to 95 or 90 cents, it would go from 5,000 in one season to 6,500, let's say, and then it would go plus or minus 3%, 1%. As soon as someone buys a bit of pods and it goes to, let's say, 95 cents, it would drop down again for one time by a big amount, and then goes back again to 1 and 3%. So what you're saying is, there's going to be a one-time big change, and that's only going to be offered, for a certain amount, and it goes away, and it doesn't continue in that sense. First of all, does this make sense? And then what do you think about that?
I understand the question. In short, what you're proposing is that the temperature moves faster when there is higher bean price volatility in order to minimize bean price volatility. And in general, the way Beanstalk works is that it is designed to slowly change the temperature as opposed to quickly, such that there is an opportunity for people that want to buy beans significantly above the peg, or sell beans significantly below the peg, for whatever reason, have the opportunity to do so. And Beanstalk doesn't shy away from volatility in any capacity, and this includes how it changes the weather. So when you think about how does Beanstalk enter a death spiral, when it can't find any creditors at any price, the way is that the amount of debt that it has is too high. And the issue that you want to avoid is Beanstalk having to pay too high of an interest rate, a temperature, such that the pod line starts to grow too fast and the pod rate gets out of hand. And the only way for that to really happen is if Beanstalk increases the temperature too quickly, right? If Beanstalk doesn't increase the temperature quickly at all, well, then it's not going to overpay and increase the pod rate too much. Whereas if it's going to increase the temperature very quickly, it is at risk of overpaying and issuing too many pods and getting itself in this negative feedback loop. We're at a much higher risk of entering that negative feedback loop. So Beanstalk makes the explicit trade-off of, instead of moving the temperature faster to minimize bean price volatility, it is comfortable with the bean price volatility in order to minimize the chances that it overpays for pods in order to minimize volatility, and in doing so, enter some sort of death spiral. Because as in the scenario you laid out, the weather goes from 5,000 to 6,500, and then what if the price goes even lower? Now does it go from 6,500 to 10,000? What about another season? Does it go to 20,000? Like, very quickly, you can get yourself into trouble. And even if it's a day or 2 days or 3 days, markets tend to be vicious when those types of mechanisms exist in making sure that those types of feedback loops are entered. So the goal is for Beanstalk to be resistant to that feedback loop, and the way it does that is trading off convertibility and accepting the volatility in the bean price.
Okay. We have a question that asks, what happens if the bond raises more liquidity than what was in the bean 3 curve pool pre-exploit?
So there's only 77 million for sold, such that is impossible. So that shouldn't happen.
And just to clarify, the 77 million includes all of the pools, not just the bean 3 curve.
Oh yeah, good catch. I see Bernoulli bean typing, an old farmer. How about that?
Right. Anti-fragility or fragility feels like a good framework here. Anti-fragility means more volatility in steady state, but less exposure to extreme volatility events. I guess that's a comment to what you were discussing about controlling the temperature.
I would agree, and it's trading off extreme volatility like a full collapse to zero, with maybe downside volatility to 10 cents or 2 cents, but never to zero. It will always, if it's sufficiently anti-reflexive, the bean price should always return to its peg. The question is, what is an acceptable amount of volatility such that there's utility?
He can't wait for restart. I guess, all farmers looking forward to that. Okay, we're at the end of the town hall questions. If anyone else has other questions, please feel free to drop them. Otherwise, we'll give it a minute or two. Do you want to take this time, Publius, maybe, and discuss a little bit about Seraph before the DAO meeting? Or would you rather that we have this later?
Well, I think there was a lot said in the last, or a significant amount said in the last DAO meeting on Thursday, and unclear from our perspective on what the right thing to do is when it comes to managing the permissionlessness of governance with security. And Seraph might be interesting as a first step or an intermediate step towards fully permissionless on-chain governance once again, which is what everyone's goal is. So I think it's exciting that the Halborn team is presenting this to the DAO. Hopefully people come and ask, intelligent questions on how things will work and what levels of permissionless there are and anything else that is relevant. And hopefully that gives everyone a good sense of whether this is the type of product that we want to integrate into the contracts in the near future in order to minimize the risk associated with moving back to on-chain governance. So that's the main question on the Seraph front. We're big fans of the Halborn team. They just announced a big Series A, which is pretty cool. And one thing that we hope to do is to engage them in some sort of continuous retainer, such that they can work on Beanstalk and Beanstalk DAO related projects continuously. So that'll be on Thursday that they're talking about Seraph. And I guess in general, if people have other questions about their relationship with Beanstalk, they can probably answer that too. But the main focus on Thursday is about Seraph. So they're going to be talking to the DAO and answering any questions on Thursday.
Do you know if the Beanstalk DAO or the BCM members would have unilateral ability or authority to rescind Seraph's control at any point, or that's not possible?
Yes, it could be.
How doesn't that beat the purpose of it? If someone controls Beanstalk, then they just remove them. What did we
well, that's kind of the point, right? So it's a question of, well, who has, if with the supermajority you could remove Seraph, then it still wouldn't have prevented an attack, right? So it's hard to know. These really are the substantive questions that I think they have decent answers for, which they claim that they will, if you leave the keys with them, meaning they are the ones, you don't introduce some sort of kill switch at the contract level where you can remove Seraph without Seraph's permission. But what they will do is they will turn off Seraph on their end. And if you accept that they will do that, and I think that's part of the contract that they'll sign. Obviously, that's not related to permissionlessness. This is kind of the whole point. It's a question of, well, what is the DAO comfortable with over a let's call it a 1-year period of time while things are moving back to on-chain governance. The permissionless governance system is being tested. How do people feel about another service having this, this control or partial control in the sense that they can prevent things from happening to the contract, very specific things that can be explicitly defined. It's up to the DAO whether that's something that people are comfortable with, if the goal is to do it over a short period of time, not in perpetuity. I think in perpetuity it's much less attractive, but it is probably attractive as an intermediate step.
Can we have some form of a governance architecture that goes on like we'll have BCM members, and those are the ones that can change code, and then you have Seraph as a backstop, but then the DAO would have another team that can remove or rescind the keys from Seraph, but can't change the Beanstalk code. So you'd have a team that can push updates, and then another team that can only revoke Seraph's keys.
Yes, anything is possible. And would just comment that sounds like, something like the first iteration of use of Seraph. The goal is to move off of the BCM and back to on-chain governance. And that's where Seraph will be particularly helpful as an extra layer of protection. So it is probably good to get that base integration up before we move back to on-chain governance collectively. But I think, they step by step here, right? So this is why it's good to have them in front of everyone, and everyone can ask the questions directly and hear what they have to say. We don't like to be middlemen.
Okay, I'm not informed about governance in general, or this, I guess, maybe not informed about many things. How does Ethereum and Bitcoin and all of these other chains, how do they run their governance?
Well, proof of work blockchains, it's simply a question of which software are the nodes with the majority of hash power running. So that's, if there's a fork, there can be a fork because people are running different software. And in a proof of stake blockchain, there's only one chain with no fork because you basically get slashed if you propose a shorter fork. But in theory, I guess you could try to replicate the whole other state in another proof of stake chain. Haven't thought exactly through how that would work in a fork scenario all the way, to be honest. But the difficulty is all of the exogenous value that you have represented on that proof of stake chain, like USDC, for example. The USDC can only be honored on one of the chains. So you can copy the state of the proof of stake chain and start, issue a different, recreate the chain. But the concept is the value of the chain really comes from the value of the other stuff that is on it, and the consensus of the people that are using the chain to continue to recognize that particular chain as the main chain. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 on where the value from a proof of stake system comes from, but that's the hope of using a proof of stake system is that it's sufficiently bootstrapped such that it's resistant to that type of thing.
I thought that this is how consensus or validation works, but governance is done differently or separately. Am I not understanding this correctly?
They're one and the same thing in practice when it comes to the layer one blockchain. So a blockchain is different than a smart contract.
Okay, I'll continue maybe with a question. Let's say now Ethereum wants to push an update. How does that work? Who pushes it, and then how does it get approved?
Well, to be honest, it'd be much better to have Publius 1703 up here. I don't even are they even here? I don't know if they're here. So
No, I don't
I'll give you my non-developer version of it, which is that if there's an upgrade to the Ethereum blockchain, it depends whether it's a soft fork or a hard fork. In the case of a hard fork, it requires some sort of coordination between all of the miners to at once start to use a new piece of software. Whereas if it's a soft fork, each of the nodes can upgrade to the software at any point that they choose. So the distribution of that software and the election of the nodes to use that software is dependent on whether or not it's a hard fork or a soft fork. And whether that is a hard fork or a soft fork depends on what what is the specific change for the blockchain that is being implemented.
Okay, thank you for that answer. All right, I think no more questions from my side, and none others are in the town hall chat. So maybe we can call it class here for now. Thank you, Publius, for your time, and see you next class.
Thank you, man. Take care.